Good evening. For the last few chapters, we've been studying ecosystems. We've looked at how ecosystems form. We've looked at what ecosystems do in terms of producing food and recycling nutrients. We've looked at the complex interaction of how various living and non-living things interact with each other in an ecosystem in order to sustain each other and sustain the ecosystem. In Chapter 5, we're going to look at how matter and energy flow through an ecosystem so as to keep it operating. And we're also going to look at what happens when there is a major disturbance to this flow and to the normal operation of the ecosystem, and study how an ecosystem can come back from rather dramatic changes to its environment. We're going to begin our discussion of Chapter 5 by looking at the way in which matter flows through an ecosystem. You recall that food originates from the process of photosynthesis carried out by green plants and trees that are able to use the energy of the sun to convert inorganic matter, such as water and carbon dioxide, into organic matter, primarily glucose. This glucose then serves as a storage form of energy to be used by living systems in the process of respiration in order to support the functions of living cells. This first level within an ecosystem of biotic participants are known as the producers. They're also known as autotrophs. Autotrophs meaning that they can make their own energy source. They can make their own food from inorganic nutrients. These producers then are called producers because they produce food which can be consumed by themselves and or can be consumed by those organisms that feed on the producers. Producers characteristically are photosynthetic green plants that use chlorophyll to absorb light energy to produce glucose. Besides photosynthetic plants, though, there are also some photosynthetic bacteria and also chemosynthetic bacteria, which are also capable of producing food through similar processes as occurs in green plants and animals. So the producers then are the basic biotic component of an ecosystem responsible for creating food from sustainable materials such as sunlight, carbon dioxide, and water. The next level up, if you will, in what we call trophic levels or feeding levels, are what we call the consumers. The consumers are one of two components of a larger category known as heterotrophs. Heterotrophs, unlike autotrophs, must feed on organic matter that has been produced by autotrophs. Heterotrophs cannot produce their own food. They can only consume the food that has been produced by the autotrophs. The heterotrophs in turn have two subcategories, the consumers and the decomposers. Amongst the consumers, there are several types, the first of which are the herbivores. The herbivores are animals that feed primarily on plants. Okay? They consume the plants in order to harvest the glucose that the plants have produced as a result of photosynthesis. The next level up in the consumers category are the secondary consumers, which are also known as carnivores. The carnivores feed on the herbivores, or primary consumers. The carnivores then depend upon the food produced by the muscle tissue that is built out of the food that the herbivores consume. When an herbivore consumes green plants, much of that energy that the green plants provide the herbivores as food is used to support cellular respiration. Any food that is left over, or energy from the food that is left over, is then converted into tissue, mainly muscle tissue and other tissues necessary for the growth and maintenance of the animal. This tissue then becomes the food for the secondary consumers, things that we know of as meat, The secondary consumers then consume that meat that's produced by the excess um, organic matter consumed by the herbivores. We can go even higher up on this category into higher orders of consumers and carnivores that feed on the carnivores themselves. And then, interestingly enough, the highest order, if you will, of consumers are parasites that actually infect a host and feed directly off that host. And then, of course, we have an intermediate type of consumer called an omnivore. An omnivore is an animal that feeds on both plants as well as animals. It's both herbivore and carnivore. And of course, the most obvious example of an omnivore are humans. Humans like to have a nice salad along with their steak, and we are capable of consuming organic matter that is produced by both plants as well as animals. The other major category of heterotrophs, that is, organisms that must consume their food because they cannot make it, are the decomposers. The decomposers are a very important component of the feeding categories or trophic categories within an ecosystem, so important that they have their own classification. Decomposers are organisms that feed on dead organic material. Decomposers include such things as scavengers that eat larger dead things. This would be like hyenas and vultures and those kinds of things. But it also includes a category known as detritus feeders. Detritus feeders are organisms that feed directly on decaying and dead material. These things would include such things as mushrooms and various kinds of other bacterial feeders, or non-bacterial feeders rather, that are capable of breaking down organic matter into its basic components. And then we have the chemical decomposers, which are fungi and bacteria that cause rotting. And through the process of rotting, as the chemical decomposers, as well as the detritus feeders, are able to break down the chemical bonds that hold organic matter together and return the basic elements of that organic matter, primarily carbon and hydrogen, back to the soil, where they can be recycled through the carbon cycle and the nitrogen cycle and the other cycles that you studied earlier. So these three categories, producers, consumers, and decomposers, make up what we call the trophic or feeding cycles or feeding levels within an ecosystem. This is sometimes known as the food chain. So here we see a graphic of a food chain within an ecosystem. The food chain begins with the lowest level, which are the producers, that is the green plants that capture energy from the sun and produce glucose, the first organic component in the feeding cycle of an ecosystem. After the producers come the first level of consumers, the herbivores that feed on the plants, and then above them are the second level of consumers, which we know as carnivores, that feed upon the herbivores. And then there can even be a third level of consumer, such as predator birds, that feed on the second level carnivores. So we have, if you will, a food ladder beginning with the lowest producers up through the herbivores, the carnivores, and the higher order of carnivores. One of the important things to notice, of course, in this food chain is the relative mass of material that goes into each one of these levels of the food chain. If we look at it from that viewpoint, we see that there is a large amount of the mass in any given ecosystem devoted to the producers. And because that is where all the food originally comes from. However, for every 100 pounds, if you will, of producer, that 100 pounds of producer can only sustain or feed, if you will, about 10 pounds of an herbivore. And that's because 90% of the energy that is produced by the um, producers is used to support the life function of the producer itself. Only about 10% of it goes into making tissue within the producer, the tissue cells of the green plants, which then are consumed as food by the herbivores. So the herbivores can only tap into about 10% of all the energy that the producers make. In turn, the carnivores that feed upon the herbivores, again, can only take advantage of about 10% of the biomass of the herbivore. Again, because of the fact that 90% of that energy is being used to support the life function of the herbivore itself. Only 10% of it, if you will, goes into making tissue, i.e. meat, which then is consumed by the carnivore. And then if there's another level above that, we have the same thing occurring. So what we see is that there's a tremendous loss in the amount of mass as you go from one level of the food chain to the next. And because that mass translates into energy, there's a tremendous loss of energy as you go from one trophic level to the next. This is an important concept to remember, because as the number of resources on our planet become more and more constrained, we will have to be more conscious of how to get the most energy out of the food that we have available to us on the planet. And right now, eating in the lower levels of the food chain are going to produce much more energy than feeding in the upper levels of the food chain. As we noted earlier in the course, there are many different kinds of ecosystems throughout the world, mostly determined by the amount of rainfall and average temperature within that ecosystem. And because there are many different types of ecosystems, the amount of biomass, that is the amount of living matter which can be used as food, varies from one ecosystem to another. In this particular graph, we see the various relationship of the amount of biomass that can be produced by different types of ecosystems, primarily in this bar in the back of the graph. And we see that the largest amount of biomass, also referred to as primary productivity, comes from algal beds and reefs. And this is primarily because of algae that grows in the oceans, which cover 2/3 of our planet, as well as the various aquaculture, including fish and other types of food that live within the oceans. Next highest are the tropical rainforest, again because of the volume of green plants that exist within a tropical rainforest. So algal beds in the oceans and tropical rainforests are responsible for the majority of food that is produced through the process of photosynthesis on our planet. As you might expect, the least producing ecosystems are those that have the least amount of life, because they're in the most extreme conditions of either temperature or rainfall. Finally, in Chapter 5, we're going to look at how ecosystems change in response to either long-term influences such as global climate change, and or in response to rather dramatic short-term changes as might occur in, say, a forest fire or a flood. What we'll see is that ecosystems have the capability of resetting themselves such that they can, through a process called succession, gradually either occupy a new set of ecological or environmental conditions, and or provide opportunities for new organisms to come into an ecosystem and establish themselves that were not able to prior to the event, simply because the systems and living organisms that were in the ecosystem were too well established. We'll see that through the process of natural catastrophes, nature has actually established a means for clearing and resetting ecosystems in such a way that only the strongest individuals, the most resilient, and the most biologically prepared organisms are capable of surviving and overcoming and passing on those survival characteristics to the next generation of organisms.